I took a car that only rich people could afford and put it in the hands of everyone. A car that once cost $850 eventually cost just $260. Most people thought that was impossible. At one point, I doubled my workers' pay in a single day. Every businessman in America called me reckless. I called it the smartest decision I ever made. My name is Henry Ford. By the time I was done, my factories had built 15 million cars and changed the way the world makes everything. I started with nothing, a farm in Michigan, and 8 years of school. This is the incredible story of how I built the Ford Motor Company. I was born on July 30, 1863, on a farm in Springwells Township, Michigan. 90 acres of cleared fields, timber lots, and livestock. My father, William, had come from Ireland in 1847 with nothing and built that farm from the ground up. He was proud of it, and he expected me to take it over when the time came. I knew from early on that I was not going to do that. It was not that I was lazy. I was up before dawn every day doing chores like everyone else. What bothered me about farm work was how inefficient it was. Everything took longer than it needed to. Every task was done the same way it had always been done, with no thought about whether there was a faster or better way to do it. I watched grown men spend entire days doing work that a decent machine could have handled in an hour. That gap between how things were done and how they could be done was something I could not stop thinking. In 1875, when I was 12 years old, my father took me on a trip into Detroit. On the road, we came across a Nichols and Shepard road engine, a large steam-powered machine mounted on wheels, moving under its own power with no horse pulling it. I had never seen anything like it. I jumped off my father's wagon before he had fully stopped and walked straight up to the operator. I asked him about the boiler pressure, the gear ratios, how the drive mechanism worked. He answered every question. I stood there for as long as I could. That was the moment everything shifted for me. The following year, in 1876, my mother Mary died from complications during childbirth. I was 12 years old. Years later, I said that I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother on the farm I loved. After she was gone, the daily routine felt like something I was simply enduring. The one reason I had felt at home there was gone. My father gave me a pocket watch around that time. Most boys would have carried it and left it at that. By the time I was 15, I had taken it apart and put it back together so many times I could do it in the dark. I made my own tools to work on the mechanism, filed darning needles into picks, and shaped my own tweezers. I started repairing watches for neighbors across the county without charging anything. I just wanted to understand how things worked. My father thought I would never settle. He told a neighbor once that my brothers John and William were doing fine, but that Henry worried him. He did not know what was going to become of me. In 1879, at 16, I left the farm without his approval and walked 9 miles to Detroit. I got my first job at a machinery shop called James F. Flower and Brothers at $3 a week. My room and board cost $3.50, so I took a second job at night repairing watches to cover the difference. I later moved to the Detroit Dry Dock Company, where I spent 3 years learning iron casting, lathe operation, gear cutting, and steam system installation. By the time I finished, I understood how machines were built from the inside out. In 1891, I was hired as a night engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. By 1893, I had been promoted to chief engineer at $100 a month. The position required me to be available around the clock to maintain power generation across the city, but it also gave me access to an engine shop, electrical equipment, and enough flexibility in my schedule to run my own experiments on the side. I had an idea I had been working on for years, and I was finally in a position to build it. On Christmas Eve, in 1893, I clamped a small engine to my kitchen table and asked my wife Clara to pour gasoline into the intake valve while I spun the flywheel by hand. The engine sputtered, caught, and ran. Clara dripped a little extra fuel to keep it going. The kitchen light flickered because I had wired the ignition directly into the house circuit. It was not pretty, but it worked, and that was all I needed to know. I'd been thinking about the internal combustion engine for years. Everyone around me in the industry was convinced that electric vehicles were the future. The logic made sense on the surface. Electric motors were clean, quiet, and reliable, but I kept coming back to one problem. An electric vehicle needs to stay close to a power station to recharge. A gasoline engine carries its own power source on board. It can go anywhere. Nobody was building for anywhere. They were building for cities. I was thinking about the whole country. I spent the next 2.5 years building a full vehicle in a brick shed behind my house on Bagley Avenue. I worked on it at night after my shifts at Edison. Clara brought me food and kept the lamp filled. By the early morning of June 4, 1896, the vehicle was finished. I had built it around an angle iron frame with 4 bicycle wheels, a 2-cylinder engine, 2 forward speeds, and a doorbell mounted at the front to warn people I was coming. I rolled it toward the shed door and stopped. The vehicle was 45 inches wide. The door was not. I picked up an axe and knocked the wall out. My assistant, James Bishop, rode a bicycle ahead of me down Bagley Avenue to warn any horse carriages that something unusual was coming. I hand-cranked the engine and drove out into the night. We got about a mile before an ignition spring failed, and the car stopped in the middle of Washington Boulevard. Bishop and I pushed it to the nearest Edison station. I fashioned a replacement spring, and we kept going. That was the first Ford vehicle, 500 pounds, no brakes, no reverse gear, and a doorbell for a horn. I sold it later that year for $200 to fund the next build. In August 1896, I attended the annual Edison Illuminating Convention in New York, where I was introduced to Thomas Edison. Someone at the dinner mentioned I was building a gasoline-powered vehicle. Edison turned to me and started asking questions. I sketched the engine design on the back of a dinner menu. He studied it, then struck the table with his fist and told me I had the right idea. He said electric cars had to stay near power stations, but my car carried its own power plant. No fire, no boiler, no smoke, no steam. He told me to keep going. Those words from the most respected inventor in the country were all I needed. I resigned from Edison Illuminating in 1899 and went into business. The first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, collapsed in January 1901. I spent all my time modifying designs and never established a production line. We burned through $15,000 and produced almost nothing worth selling. I learned that building one perfect vehicle and building 1,000 reliable ones are completely different problems. The second company, the Henry Ford Company, ended in March 1902 when my investors pushed me out for spending too much time on a race car instead of a passenger vehicle. They handed my own chassis design to a machinist named Henry Leland, who reorganized the assets and renamed the company Cadillac. 2 companies, both gone. My own design turned into a competitor's product. I learned 2 things from those failures that I never forgot. First, custom hand-built vehicles cannot scale. Second, without majority control, the company is not yours, no matter whose name is on the door. On June 16, 1903, I incorporated Ford Motor Company with 12 investors. We raised $28,000 in actual cash. I held 25.5% of their stock and bought controlling interest in 1906 using profits from early sales. Nobody was pushing me out of this one. In July 1903, we launched the Model A, priced between $800 and $900, powered by a 2-cylinder engine. We sold out our initial supply within months, but the Model A was not what I had in mind. It was a starting point. What I was actually building toward was something the industry had never seen before. A car simple enough for anyone to drive, strong enough to handle any road in the country, and cheap enough that the man who built it could afford to buy it. That car did not exist yet. I was about to build it. On October 1st, 1908, I introduced the Model T. The frame was built from vanadium steel, a lightweight, high-strength alloy I had come across at a European racing car teardown. American manufacturers were not using it. When I tested it, I understood immediately why it mattered. The same structural strength at a fraction of the weight on rough country roads, which was most roads in America at the time. That difference was everything. The Model T had a 20-horsepower 4-cylinder engine, 10 inches of ground clearance, and an enclosed transmission that any driver could operate without mechanical knowledge. It was not the most powerful car on the market. It was not the most comfortable, but it could go anywhere. It was easy to maintain, and it was priced at $850, already cheaper than most of what was available. I had one goal, and I never moved off it: build a car for the great multitude, not for wealthy men in cities, for the farmer in Michigan, the worker in Ohio, the family that had never owned anything with an engine before. If I could put that family in a car, I could change how the entire country moved. The first year, we produced 10,660 units. Demand kept climbing. I needed more space and a better system. In 1910, I opened the Highland Park plant outside Detroit. The building was designed to optimize the flow of materials from the top floor down. Raw components came in at the top, and finished vehicles rolled out at the bottom. It was cleaner than what we had, but it was still not fast enough. The problem I kept coming back to was simple. We were moving workers around stationary cars. Every time a worker finished one task and walked to the next vehicle, time was lost. Not much time per step, but multiplied across hundreds of workers and thousands of cars. The waste was enormous. The answer was obvious once I saw it clearly. Stop moving the workers, move the car. Between April and December 1913, my engineering team and I introduced the moving assembly line at Highland Park. We broke the entire assembly process into small, standardized tasks. Each worker performed one task repeatedly as the vehicle frame moved continuously past them on a powered conveyor. We had seen a similar principle used in Chicago meatpacking plants, where carcasses moved along an overhead rail while workers processed them in sequence. We applied the same logic to building instead of breaking down. Before the assembly line, building one Model T chassis took 12 hours and 28 minutes. After, it took 1 hour and 33 minutes. Annual output went from 68,000 units in 1912 to 202,000 in 1914. The same plant, the same workers, a completely different result. But the assembly line created a new problem almost immediately. The work was repetitive, physically demanding, and mentally exhausting. A man spent 8 hours performing the same small motion over and over while the line kept moving. If he slowed down, the whole line slowed down. By 1913, worker turnover at Highland Park had reached 370%. I was replacing my entire workforce nearly 4 times a year. New workers made more mistakes. More mistakes meant more defects. More defects meant higher costs. On January 5th, 1914, I announced the $5 day. Every qualified worker at Ford Motor Company would earn $5 for an 8-hour shift. The previous wage was $2.34 for 9 hours. I was more than doubling the pay and cutting an hour off the working day at the same time. Every other businessman in America reacted exactly the way I expected. They called me a socialist. Wall Street said I would be bankrupt within a year. One newspaper editorial said I was corrupting the labor market. I said it was the best cost-cutting move I ever made, and I meant it. By 1915, annual turnover had dropped from 370% to under 16%. Daily absenteeism fell from 10% to under 1%. A stable workforce made fewer errors, worked faster, and understood the process better with every passing week. The cost of training new workers constantly was far higher than the cost of paying existing workers well enough to stay. There was something else I understood that my critics did not. The men building my cars needed to be able to buy my cars. If I paid them $2 a day, they could not afford one. If I paid them $5 a day, the Model T was within reach. I was not just paying workers, I was building the customer base at the same time. As production improved, the price kept falling. $850 in 1908, $600 in 1912, $490 in 1914, $260 by 1924. The more efficient we became, the cheaper the car got and the more people could afford it. In 1914, I made one more decision that people found strange at the time. I ordered that every Model T be painted black, not because I preferred black, because Japan black enamel was the only paint that dried fast enough to keep pace with the assembly line without creating a bottleneck. Every other color took too long to cure. The line could not wait. Any customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long as it is black. That was not arrogance. That was engineering. By May 26, 1927, when the 15 millionth Model T rolled off the line, we had done something no manufacturer had done before. We had taken a product that only wealthy people could afford and made it available to almost everyone. The price had fallen by nearly 70%, while the quality had improved at every step. That is what the assembly line actually was. It was not just a faster way to build cars. It was a system that turned efficiency directly into access. Every minute we saved in production was $1 we could take off the price, and every dollar off the price was another family that could own one. I had built what I set out to build. But what came next was the part of the story I am less proud of. In 1918, I bought a small local newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. I had opinions about the world and I wanted a place to put them. That much is true. What followed is the part of my story I cannot explain away, and I will not try. Beginning in May 1920, the Dearborn Independent ran a 91-week series of articles blaming Jewish communities for financial crises, social instability, and corruption across the world. The articles were later compiled into 4 volumes called The International Jew and distributed through Ford dealerships across the United States and in countries overseas. They were translated into multiple languages. They reached millions of people. Former presidents Woodrow Wilson and William Howard Taft publicly condemned what was being published under my name. In 1925, a lawyer named Aaron Shapiro filed a federal libel lawsuit against me over claims printed in the paper. In July 1927, I settled the lawsuit out of court, closed the Dearborn Independent, and issued a formal apology. I stated that I had been unaware of the specific content being printed under my name. Most people did not believe that. I am not sure I would have believed it either. Whatever my intentions were, the damage was real. The publication carried my name, ran through my newspaper, and was distributed through my dealerships. The man who had spent 20 years arguing that efficiency and access could improve ordinary people's lives had put his name on material that targeted an entire group of people. Those two things belong to the same record. Inside my plants, the story followed a similar pattern. As the company grew through the 1920s and 1930s, I placed management of the workforce under a man named Harry Bennett. Bennett was a former Navy boxer who built an internal security operation using ex-convicts and private guards to monitor workers and suppress anyone attempting to organize a union. I believed unions would interfere with how I ran my operations. I had built a system that worked, and I did not want outside influence disrupting it. On May 26, 1937, a group of United Auto Workers organizers, including Walter Reuther, stood on a pedestrian overpass outside my River Rouge plant, distributing union literature to workers arriving for their shifts. Bennett's men attacked them. Reuther and several other organizers were beaten severely. Press photographers were present, and the images ran on front pages across the country the following morning. The National Labor Relations Board condemned what had happened. 4 years later, in June 1941, facing a strike at the Rouge complex and significant pressure from my wife, Clara, I signed the company's first collective bargaining agreement with the UAW. Clara had a way of making me see things I had decided not to look at. My son Edsel had been president of Ford Motor Company since 1919. For years, he pushed for updated vehicle designs, modern management structures, and safety improvements like hydraulic brakes to keep pace with General Motors and Chrysler. I overruled him more times than I should have. I had built the system, and I trusted it more than I trusted what was changing around it. That was a mistake I recognized too late. Edsel died in May 1943 at 49 years old, stomach cancer. He had spent his entire career trying to move the company forward while I held it in place. I reassumed the presidency after his death, but my health was failing, and my judgment was not what it had been. The United States War Department considered intervening in the company's operations to protect military production during the war. In September 1945, Clara and Edsel's widow, Eleanor, made clear that I needed to step down. I handed the company to my grandson, Henry Ford II. I died on April 7, 1947, at my estate in Dearborn. I was 83 years old. In January 1956, Ford Motor Company completed its public offering, selling shares to the public for the first time. It generated over $640 million. At the time, it was the largest corporate IPO in American history. Ford Motor Company still operates today. The assembly line system built at Highland Park in 1913 is still the foundation of how the world manufactures almost everything. The Model T is still studied as the moment personal transportation became something ordinary people could access. I built what I said I would build, a car for the great multitude. I got that part right. The rest of it, I leave for you to weigh. I built a system that put the world on wheels. What I could not build was a version of myself that only did the good parts.